Wonderful.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 8, a roundtable discussion on storytelling traditions in Canadian life writing about the Holocaust. My name is Stephanie Corazza, and I'm the manager of academic programs for the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program. For those of you who don't know, it's a Canadian nonprofit program that publishes firsthand accounts of the Holocaust written by survivors who later immigrated to Canada. And we distribute the books free of charge to scholars, students, and researchers across the country. The origin, the idea for this roundtable is a recently published memoir from our series titled A Promise of Sweet Tea by Pinchas Eliyahu Blit. I wanted to begin by giving a very short summary of the book, because I know not everyone here is familiar with it, and very briefly share a couple of significant elements that stood out to my colleagues and I at the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program and made us really want to share it with scholars and hear their expert perspectives on the book. After that, I will introduce the participants who are going to discuss some key themes and questions raised in this book. Pinchas Blit's memoir is a vividly told story of a life interrupted by the Holocaust. It's divided into 3 parts, the first of which is devoted to his childhood in Korazza, a humble, vibrant village in the backwoods of Western Ukraine. There, young Pinchas lives in fear of Cossacks and wolves and the local anti-Semitic children, but he finds belonging in the rich texts and traditions of his ancestors. When the Soviets invade, Pinchas's life is infused with new meaning as he innocently devotes himself to the teachings of Comrade Stalin. Part 2, which is the bulk of the memoir, covers the Holocaust period. When the Nazis arrive, Pinchas witnesses his beloved village being brutally attacked, and as his family seeks safety in the marshes and forests, their precarious existence brings Pinchas face to face with his own mortality and faith. At the end of the war, Pinchas's nuclear family miraculously remains whole, but their extended family and community have been destroyed. In the final part of the book, we follow his family's escape from the Soviet-occupied East and resettlement in Montreal, including his later contribution to the Yiddish theater community there. And we also hear about how his reflections on how the Holocaust has affected his life. A Promise of Sweet Tea is special for many reasons. I wanted to briefly share just 2 connected elements, which are the author's storytelling style and his use of language. Pinchas Blit is a born storyteller. His vivid account of his life marries the old world and the new, demonstrating a continuity of traditions and identity despite a profound rupture and linguistic shift. Yiddish language and folklore permeate his account, lending the memoir a distinctive style that transports you to the lost world of the shtetl, while also bearing witness to its people and spirit from his present day point of view. Thinking about stories and audiences is a key consideration for the Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program in our work with mainly student audiences. Some of the participants in this session and I got to witness the genuine and friendly rapport that Pinchas has with his audience. In this case, it was post-secondary students from University of Ottawa, York, and Trent, who met Pinchas last year in a virtual question and answer period. Whether he's telling his story on the page or in person, Pinchas is a warm communicator who draws you right into his story. David Roskies, who wrote the introduction to the memoir, ends his introduction with these words, quote, "These memoirs are so full of life, of dialogue, of laughter through tears that they might easily belong in the Yiddish theater. In fact, I would say that the reader is getting 2 books for the price of 1. A Promise of Sweet Tea is actually a Yiddish memoir that just happens to have been written in English." End quote. This brings me to a second feature of the memoir to highlight, which is language. The memoir is, of course, written in English, which is not one of the languages in which Pinchas experienced his early life in the Holocaust. And the book is full of vocabulary reflecting the linguistic diversity of the region in which he lived. Throughout the book, Pinchas dips in and out of Russian, Ukrainian, Biblical Hebrew, and of course, Yiddish. And considering how to integrate non-English words and vocabulary was a challenge for the book's primary editor, Devorah Levin, especially given our mainly student audience. So she thought really carefully about this and discussed with many others how to present transliterations and translations in a way that would preserve his narrative voice and use of language while maintaining clarity. At the Memoirs program, our goal is to make choices that preserve the integrity of the author, in this case, Pinchas's linguistic history, and also be able to transmit the richness of that story to the readers. So Pinchas's storytelling style, along with the book's use of language, are two of several themes that I think will be addressed in today's discussion. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the participants. First is David S. Kaufman, who is the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and an associate professor in the Department of History at York University. He is the author of The Jews Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2019 and was the winner of a 2020 Association for Jewish Studies Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. He is also the editor of No Better Home, Jews, Canada, and the Sense of Belonging, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2021. He serves as the Associate Director of York's Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, and is the editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies. Vardit Lightstone is a doctoral candidate in a joint education placement program between the University of Toronto and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Vardit's doctoral research focuses on the personal narratives of Yiddish-speaking migrants to Canada from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her PhD research has been supported by SSHRC, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, Canadian Friends of Hebrew U, and Dat Hamacom. Vardit was recently selected as one of the Yiddish Book Center's 2022 Translation Fellows and will be working on Trader Ed and Other Stories of the Canadian North and the Old Country by Elhonan Hansen. Kalman Weiser is the Silber Family Chair of Modern Jewish Studies at York University. His research focuses on modern Jewish history and culture, specifically about language issues in Jewish life. His two most recent publications are a chapter called Vilna on the St. Lawrence, Montreal is the Would-Be Haven for Yiddish Culture in No Better Home. And he also co-edited Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism along with Saul Goldberg and Scott Urry, published by Palgrave in 2021. Our final participant today is Rebecca Margolis. Unfortunately, she's not able to be with us, so I will be reading her responses to the questions, but I'll give you her bio so you can get to know her a little bit. Rebecca Margolis is the Director and Pratt Foundation Chair of Jewish Civilization at the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization at Monash University. Her primary area of research is the cultural production of migrants and their descendants, in particular as it intersects with language continuity. Her publications examine the Jewish experience at the intersections of language, literature, theater, film, education, and organizational life. Her forthcoming monograph, Yiddish Lives On, Journeys of Language Revitalization, examines strategies for the transmission of a lesser spoken language and culture in the areas of publishing, education, community and youth activism, performance, cinema, and new media. So together, the five of us have prepared 5 questions, and the participants will respond to select questions based on their interests and fields of expertise. Kalman Weiser will act as the moderator, so I'll pass things off to him in just a moment to get things started. I just wanted to also mention that I see that Pinchas Blit is in the audience watching. He gets to be in the audience for a change today, so it's great to have him here. And if anyone would like a copy of his memoir, I'll put my email in the chat so you can get in touch with me and I'll have that sent to you. With that, I will turn things over to Kalman Weiser to begin the discussion with the first question. And when it's Rebecca's turn to answer, I will read her response. Over to you, Kalman.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction and welcome everybody. Welcome my fellow panelists. Great pleasure to be here this morning. Like many of you, I am not at home. I'm sitting in a hotel room in Ann Arbor. We have, as Stephanie mentioned, 5 questions, and we have that gives us about 10 minutes per question. So I'll be, trying to keep us this close to the time as possible. The first question is a general question. I'd like each of the panelists to identify something that really struck them, something that was salient in the memoir. I'll make myself the last speaker because I know how much I have to say. I don't know how much you have to say on this question. So would you like to start with Vardit?
Sure, thank you. And I want to say welcome to Pinchas. I'm very happy to hear he's in the audience today. So what I did is I've chosen a section from the memoir that I'd like to read out because I think it really communicates the humor in this book as well as some elements that really define or that Pinchas uses to define his life. And it's a description of him starting to drive in Canada. So it's from page 251, if you have the book and want to follow along. And he writes, after several years, my parents also purchased a 2-door white Ford vehicle from the Sternthal Motors in my name, even though I had no earnings and didn't yet know how to drive a car. Neither did my parents. One day, after a number of driving lessons, my friend Donald Hamilton was teaching me how to parallel park in front of our house, while my mother, the eternal optimist, stood in the entrance offering her encouraging words. You will never learn how to drive. By then, I knew how to drive and had even taught my father how to drive. Donald was just showing me the trick of parallel parking. So in this quote, you get that humor, you get that close connection with his family and his community, and also that kind of old habits die hard. For his parents, he will always be that child that they can talk to that way. And despite everything that he went through, he still has that strong family connection, and he still has that humor. And it just kind of defines, I feel, the whole memoir.
Okay, David.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here, and hello, Pinchas, and hello, Dvora. The editor of the book is also here. I'm glad you could make it to the panel as well. That's a great thing to have highlighted. Vardit, Pinchas is a great combination in a literary voice of naivete and kind of irony, which don't often go together. So the thing that kind of highlighted, or the first thing, I suppose, the most salient thing that stood out for me was just how important this book is as a testimony of survival in the East, in the Russian side of the Holocaust, what historians call the Holocaust of bullets. This is a Holocaust that takes place in forests and in small towns, and not in ghettos and concentration camps that are sort of Poland centered and Poland and Germany centered. And historians know, more and more increasingly about this sort of Eastern version of the Holocaust. But there are not as many memoirs and as many survivor voices that tell stories from this side of history. So I think that's really important. And in particular, there's a lot of important kind of Russian Soviet dimensions to this. So I was really struck by Pinchas's sort of descriptions, his account of how he internalized Stalinist propaganda and its articulation from a child's point of view, which I thought was really stunning and, an important literary and narrative move. So the place of Russia and of Russians in the book as liberators, as soldiers who provide safety, unlike, generally contrasted with Ukrainians and of course the Germans in the book, makes the kind of whole Russian and Soviet dimension of the book, I thought, very interesting, both within the text and as a book that's in context of reading about the Holocaust.
Great, thank you, David. Stephanie, would you like to read Rebecca's remarks?
Yes, thank you. So two very different responses so far, and a third now from Rebecca. Something very different stood out to her. Rebecca writes, the most distinctive feature for me is the narrative voice in the memoir, where we hear the voice of the child Pinchas was when he experienced the events. This is due to the process of writing this memoir. When Pinchas retired about 5 years ago in his 80s, he dedicated himself to a project of discovering and recording his childhood memories, with a writing course in order to guide him. This process of active remembering and recording helped him to unlock memories that he had buried for over 70 years. The result is a vivid episodic narrative told in the voice of Pinchas's inquisitive child, steeped in traditional Jewish culture, excited about what life had to offer, with all of the raw emotions at the surface.
Thank you, Stephanie and Rebecca via proxy. I'll add a few words, or maybe a lot of words. First of all, David Roskies was my professor, and I can't help thinking that everything that, Pinchas had a great influence on David Roskies. They're both great storytellers, both English and in Yiddish. But more to the point, what struck me really is this Ukrainian-Jewish relationship, and I'll develop this idea of a triangle: Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians later, I hope. But we oscillate in this book, in this account, both in the introduction and the memoir itself, between describing Kortelisi, or Yiddish Kortilis, as a shtetl and a village, right? These are two distinct things, yet in the narrative they're described in both ways. And obviously, from different perspectives, it's different things. It's both a Ukrainian village. It's also, I would say, really more of a village for Jews too, rather than a shtetl, but it has shtetl-like features in some ways. What's the big difference? Well, for one thing, the size. In a shtetl, usually Jews are a much larger size of the population, sometimes the majority. Sometimes they're even as much as 80% of the population. Here, it's much smaller. It's really majority Ukrainian. Overwhelmingly Ukrainian, in fact. The other detail I'll add is about this, and we could develop this, is how this place is remembered. If you Google it, you'll find mainly in Ukrainian accounts that this is a village that was razed. It was one of several hundred Ukrainian villages that were razed around 1942 because the Ukrainian population was suspected of collaboration with partisans and with the Soviets. And Ukrainian auxiliaries helping Germans killed the entire Ukrainian population. Of course, they killed the Jews as well, but they were already at this. So this is how Ukrainians typically remember it. From a Jewish standpoint, of course, Jews remember mainly the tragedy inflicted upon Jews, and yet the shtetl, or the village, gets far less attention in Jewish sources, or at least in the Jewish sources that are immediately available if you do a perfunctory search. You have to start looking deeper in Yiska, Bicha, and stuff like this if you want to find more details than a quick Google search. So it's very interesting to me how all this is remembered by different groups. And the last point I'll make is the issue of assertiveness, which has to do with the size of the community. There is both a familiarity that's expressed and a nervousness amongst the Jews with regard to Ukrainians. They know the language, they're comfortable with the habits, they're intimate with their neighbors, and yet there are limits to their self-assertiveness. Limits which would probably be different in a shtetl with a larger Jewish population, where Jews and Ukrainians, or Jews and non-Jews in general, were more on equal footing in terms of their numbers. So I'm going to stop there. Should we leave? We have a minute or so before we get to the next question. Should we move on to the next question and then deal with all the responses later? Okay, great. All right, so the next question. Okay, what did we learn about Pinchas's early life, and how do his choices shape the narrative as a whole? So maybe this time we'll go in a different order. We'll start with David first.
Sure. So, I found that the reading about Pinchas's really wrenching struggle with his naive religious conviction of his childhood, and the really devastating process of coming to learn more about the complexity of the world, both, which demolishes his faith, or partly demolishes his faith. It certainly leaves some of it intact, but it also is a deep challenge. And his need to understand what's happening in the world within the hermeneutic of the religious idiom that he uses that's so natural. I found this really devastating to read, and really very intimate, and really deep inside a kind of child's experience, a Jewish child inside a Jewish world, as this awful history is unfolding. So, I mean, there's moments of self-blame, of very deep internalization of the idea of exile as a spiritual condition, something that God is intentionally doing to the Jewish people. So this is a kind of there's a mix of childhood guilt, which is a kind of natural narcissism that children have when they think that, and of survival guilt. It's really quite devastating. So, for example, there's a passage where he describes God being horrible to the Jews in order to scare children, in order to produce deeper belief, which I found heartbreaking. Or another example of the reasons that people in his orbit are giving for survival, why survival itself happens, or why punishment happens. The most poignant example for me was his description of having built a lean-to in the forest that mixed different kinds of trees for different species of trees. And the interpretation, I think, from his father that this was a product of shatnez. It was like two different kinds of fabric species that were mixed, and therefore they were being punished by breaking God's law. So they're kind of mix of enchantment and disenchantment in the book, and I guess really an ongoing dialectic from childhood that seemed to continue through the rest of his life, even into his adult relationship with his father, until his father's death here in Canada. So I found these really interesting, that were sort of baked into his pre-war experience in the narrative, and that continued on. One other thing that I'd also like to highlight is the fusion of mythologies in the book, the Soviet mythologies and the Jewish mythologies, which Pinchas seems to do quite seamlessly, as children can do, and as adults and certainly scholars, it seems like more of a difficult thing, but seems perfectly natural for a kid. So his fusion and adoration and just the aliveness of both Stalin and Moses, and his wearing of galstuk and tzitzis, and his quoting from the 1936 Soviet Constitution and from Pirkei Avot, that kind of blend seamlessly. And this, of course, doesn't continue on. So there's one example of things that are continuous from his pre-war experiences to the post-war experiences, and an example of something that is clearly discontinuous.
Hey, thank you. So maybe we'll get to Rebecca before we get to Vardit, or Stephanie rather.
Rebecca has 2 points to make for this question. First is the faith of the family, which translated into hope, as expressed by the oft-repeated phrase in the memoir, "Weil wir seinen Jiden," because we are Jews. Although this phrase is culturally specific, the memoir recounts important interactions between Jews and non-Jews. He recounts multiple occasions where his family was helped or saved by minor actions, sometimes from Jewish or non-Jewish strangers, all of whom were ordinary people. The second point is the imperative to witness. Even as a child, Pinchas seems aware that he must recall the events he experiences and transmit his memories. His story is made up of anecdotes that recall and give names to the dead. This process is shaped by his traditional worldview and the ways in which he saw his father write down the names of those who died. His stories about his village of Cortulisi offer details about places, personalities, and practices of the people he knew, Jewish and non-Jewish. He recounts details of the local Romani genocide, then the destruction of the Jewish population, and finally the attacks on the Christian inhabitants of the village. However, he first offers details about these groups, including specific practices, foodways, folk beliefs, and customs. People are named and described in detail, not just in the process of their murder or displacement, but before, when they were alive. The narrative thus becomes a carrier of memory for the multi-ethnic civilization that was partially or completely annihilated by the Nazis and their collaborators. As one example, in his chapter called "At Home in Cortulisi," Pinchas writes on page 49 to 50, quote, "The Roma were colorful and lively. They sang and danced and played various musical instruments, traveling in enormous, beautifully decorated mobile homes and horse-drawn wagons. I remember the colored paper flowers decorating the windows of their homes. One of the Roma tunes, which I heard only once, has been seared in my memory," end quote. Some 40 pages later, he provides an eyewitness account of the brutal attacks, quote, "Until there was nothing but silence. Nothing was said, no questions were asked, and no shouts of horror and protest were heard, not by the victims or by the witnesses to the horrible massacre of the Roma in my village," end quote.
Okay, thank you. Vardit?
So what I want to say kind of connects to what David and Rebecca said about his faith and hope and how that defines him, and especially what David said about this you see the child growing up in the book, in the memoir, because it's a real life, and that struggle that he goes through from an idyllic childhood to obviously a much more complicated future. And for me, what I picked up on was this theme of family, which is actually more than a theme, it's a structure. He begins with family, he also ends his story with family. So it shapes the content and the structure of his story. And so in the idyllic childhood, he starts, the first family member he mentions is actually his grandmother, Boba Fruma. That's how close his family was. He doesn't start with his parents and his siblings. He was so close to his grandparents that his grandmother's there right at the beginning of the story. And then he slowly brings in his other grandparents and his parents and his brother and describes background for them. And this theme of family really comes, the importance of it really hit me twice, because when he starts talking about the terribly difficult events of not just the Holocaust, but before the Holocaust, the lead up to it, he and obviously we know, and we're expecting as readers, a lot of tragic things coming our way in the book. But he writes, he previously to this had been beaten by the Ukrainian police, who were collaborators with the Nazis. And on page 100, he writes, "A worse experience, more painful to me than my own beating, was when I saw my parents humiliated, threatened, and beaten up by the horrible, ignorant Ukrainian police, the scum of the earth, the dregs of humanity." And then I'll skip a little bit. And on the next page, he wrote, "Much time has passed since that incident, but I can't forget the painful scene or the evil faces of the attackers. It still tortures me to have seen my parents dehumanized like that." Again, it's the family, it's his parents, it's that structure. Seeing that challenged really brings home I don't know quite what the word is. I don't want to say the trauma right here. I don't think that's a quite word, but the terrible things that are happening to him as a child really comes home to when he sees it affecting his parents, who are the safe place and the root of the family. And later, much later, when he's living in Canada and he has a family of his own, he writes about his marriage and then his divorce, and how much of a struggle, even though he only gives a few sentences to that, it has an important place in the book and in his emotional life. He writes, "When I did marry, the marriage was good, and 3 beautiful children arrived in quick succession, Jonathan, Robert, and Happy. Then one day, on a Sunday morning, while I was watching cartoons with the children, I learned that my marriage was over. It was a shock. I thought I would never survive." By the way, this is, again, coming from someone who survived the Holocaust. "I thought of the terrible stigma attached to divorce, and I walked the streets and public places with a mark of Cain on my forehead. In my practice, I handled many divorces, and they were never pleasant. I was hoping for reconciliation, and we went for sessions with social workers and psychologists. But in the end, we were divorced." So it's important to him to describe himself as a survivor, not just as a survivor of the Holocaust, but as a survivor of a different type of struggle. And again, it's a struggle that's centered around family. But this is coming right at the end of his memoir. I think there's 3 pages left. And he follows this, the paragraph immediately following, he writes, "My children survived the divorce and grew up well and succeeded in their endeavors. They managed to maintain a balanced and good relationship with me and their mother, notwithstanding the divorce. They are happy, as am I, with their spouses and my grandchildren. I am also happy with my partner in life for the last 26 years, Giselle Rucker." I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. So he immediately follows that challenge to the family unit with a reassurance that it worked out okay. He has a wonderful family, and it's 3 generations, and that's one of the notes that he ends his life story on. So he begins his story by talking about the family he grew up in and how close it was. And he ends his story with talking about the family he created and how happy it is. So that's how family really kind of brackets the whole story and gives him this structure and for his life.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next question. I'm just going to reiterate or elaborate on something that was brought up. I was very much impressed by the tremendous moral compass that guides Pinchas throughout, which is largely grounded in both a Jewish ethical tradition, religiously based, but also just the culture of Eastern European Jewry that goes beyond religious culture, and this tremendous sense of responsibility to others that you already spoke about in various ways. So it's quite remarkable how he maintains this moral grounding throughout the terrible events that encompass him throughout this memoir. Okay, the next question is, we're moving on to the subject of audience. And I'd like you to consider the relationship between the narrator and his immediate and imagined audience. Does Pinchas's experience as a performer shape his storytelling style? So maybe this time we'll start with Vardit this time.
Yeah, there's so much to say, I think, that and information that I don't even have to get into this about his relationship with his audience. But I would say 100% his experience, not only as a performer, as an actor in Yiddish theater, but also as a public persona in general, who was known in the Montreal Jewish community, and someone who traveled and talked about his life with people, the people that he met, with his children and grandchildren. And one of the ways that I see it very strongly is his ethnographic eye. And that relates to, as an actor in Yiddish theater, he would have had to perform scenes and think, okay, how do we create, if we're doing a play that's set in 1890 or in 1920 in Poland or Russia or Ukraine, how do we create that here? How do you set that scene? And it starts one thinking about what are the lifeways? How are the houses built? How are people dressing? What songs might there have been in the background? And that ethnographic eye comes through so strongly in his story. I, as an ethnographer myself, I was reading this, and even the chapter heading, sometimes I'm like, that's how an ethnographer might write a memoir, or a book based on their research, where there's a chapter dedicated to healers. And not only does he have a chapter dedicated to healers and magic customs, which, okay, a lot of people might find that interesting in it, he includes naming customs. I want to just find that very quickly, because and he says that in the village there were two people named Yidel. So one is dairy or milchik Yidel, and one is meat or fleshik Yidel. And again, a naming custom, as an ethnographer, that's really interesting. We have papers and papers of naming customs and nicknames and whatever from different cultures. And the fact that he thought to include that. He also includes discussions of religious customs, children's games, how houses are built. And he weaves it in. Sometimes he has one right after the other. So when he describes the house he built in and he grew up in, he goes into quite a bit of detail, and he talks about how they would put down new dirt on the floor for Shabbos. And already there is both a life way and a like folk religion practice. And he goes very smoothly from that to talking about Shavuos and how they would put flowers on the floor and plants on the floor for Shavuos. And then very smoothly, and clearly this is someone who has read a lot, thought a lot, talked to a lot of people. He talks about where, as a child, he thought that came from and how it fit into the community. But then as an adult, he learned more and learned that this custom is actually quite a bit older, even though they were the only family doing it locally. And he not only talks this way about his own life, but he also talks about it, as Rebecca brought up, about the lives of the people, the communities around him. So for example, he has a description about how the local Ukrainians slaughtered their pigs. And again, a really, really interesting description of how that happened. The system that they used, not only for doing it, but for preserving the meat, and how it affected their lives, how long they expected the meat to last, things like that. Even though it wasn't his own practice, he never did it, but he remembered and he recorded those details. So it's someone who's not only who's thought about these things and realized people are interested, people want to know, and it's just, to me, it's just astounding, and how he builds those ethnographic details so nicely into a very enjoyable, for the most part enjoyable, readable story.
Yeah, it's supremely readable. I'm glad you brought that up. And I mean, apart from the horrific events, it is, really a fantastic read, for lack of a better word. It keeps you going. I just wanted, before we get to David, I wanted to say something. You reminded me. I had recently a conversation with Nathan Englinger, the author, and he told me, my family's custom is we keep a piece of matzah from this year until next year. We hang it up on the wall, and then we burn it before the next Pesach. Have you ever heard of something like this? I know my family keeps customs that no one else did. And I said, of course, just look at Pinchas Bleet's memoir, page 42. It's a fantastic ethnographic resource. And by the way, it's from Volyn, right? Volyn is this part of Ukraine where the Yiddish theater, Volyn Yiddish dialect is Yiddish theater dialect. This is where Noah Prilutsky, the ethnographer and linguist, was from. We have such a rich culture of ethnographic expeditions to this region, and this is part of this tradition. It's a fantastic resource for people like me. Okay, David, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I would. So we're talking on the topic of audience and sort of narrator-audience relations, and I'm glad you guys talked about this ethnography dimension, because I'm going to talk about something different, which is about sort of time and how time flows. So we'll start with the observation that all memoirs, of course, are books of self-fashioning that are written in the present when they're written. Just as memory is alive in the present in the brain, memory is not something that's located in the past, but something that has to be activated and created in the present. So there's only present, with a question about how the past goes. So the book is obviously narrated forward from his childhood as it moves. So it's narrated forward, even though it's remembered backwards. But in this book, there's lots of regular and steady breaches of this direction, where Pinchas, as the author, reminds you that although you're moving forward, that he's writing from the end and remembers the stuff that stays into the present, thinking about the past. Now, a couple other things to mention on this sort of count is that not only does we know that the readers of Holocaust memoirs expect horror to come, but what's really interesting about this book is that Pinchas also knows about the horror that's coming, because of, he's conditioned by what he's seeing around him and the news that's making its way to his orbit, and of course the things that he sees. And so this sense of dread and doom that is of knowing that the horror is coming is, I think, really, really powerful extra psychological dimension, as in the child's experience, as time kind of moves forward and the horrors unfold. There's a refrain that is repeated throughout the book, another refrain, some people have mentioned other refrains, that goes something like, I still see, or I still hear, or I still taste, as if the present is completely continuous. And I found this also a very powerful literary device, but also just probably deeply true thing about his experience as an older man who's writing, because it's as if time both froze on some very physical in some physical ways. It's his sensory experience of the world that gets burned into his brain, or that he can still literally taste on his tongue, even as time moves forward. So this is something that I certainly know that we people who have read lots of Holocaust memoirs have noted about the experience and the sort of genre, I guess, in general, is about how time both stops and manages to continue at the same time. And I find this part quite haunting. So I'm not exactly sure when in his life Mr. Blitt began teaching and speaking about his Holocaust experiences with respect to when he wrote the memoir, but surely they're linked. And of course, he had some practice in reaching audiences, particularly younger ones, for whom this book seems to be aimed in some sense, because you can also read it as a kind of coming of age story, as a young writing that's in the young adult genre, in the sense that it's stripped down, it's very plain spoken, it's declarative, and of the many powerful and like kind of simple literary techniques that he uses are not like bogged down with anything. So there's foreshadow and irony and allusion and return. And my favorite kind of literary technique, I guess, is these very deadpan and kind of devastating short sentences that appear after a kind of descriptive setup, usually at the end of chapters. So there's a description followed by a sudden and violent end to the writing chapter. So, each chapter, or not each chapter, but many chapters have like a real setup and knockdown. Like it's very powerful. It's very powerful to read. And I think that's a kind of important feature of the storytelling. The storyteller who is prepping his readers to have an emotionally impactful experience that allows you to empathize with him as a child.
Thank you. I don't think Rebecca provided a response for this one. So we're going to move on to the next question, which is essentially a language question. A promise of sweet tea recalls a life in and between language. In what ways does language feature in this memoir? So would you like to start by reading Rebecca's words?
Rebecca shares, Pinchas is fluidly multilingual and moves easily between languages in a heterolingual context. As a child, he is equally at home speaking in Yiddish, Ukrainian, Polish, and Russian, and able to find joy in the cultures of others. This informs his commitment to recollect the communities attached to different languages. In multilingual Montreal, Pinchas is again comfortable in multiple languages, English, French, and Yiddish. Yiddish in particular comes to a space for collective healing of survivor trauma, especially in the theater. He characterizes the Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater as a site for rejuvenation, both personal and communal.
Okay, so I'm going to add a few words. This linguistic triangle that's common in traditional Jewish societies is often on my mind. And what you see here is essentially, as I said, a linguistic triangle. Pinchas speaks about it, but he doesn't problematize it or express it in the times of power dynamics that I'm going to talk about it. For him, it's completely natural. We have a situation where we have the former imperial language, Russian, still plays a role. It's going to be reintroduced when the Soviets come. When I say former imperial language, I mean that this part of Ukraine was under Russian rule for centuries. But of course, the local peasants speak Ukrainian, the Jews speak Yiddish, They know Ukrainian extremely well. His father is an expert speaker of Ukrainian, and here is, a very traditional Jew who knows all the Christian references and uses it to spice his speech. This does call, of course, to mind the kind of character of Tevye the milkman, right, who is also a village Jew, represented in the American theater as a shtetl Jew, but really a village Jew in the Yiddish original, right, completely conversant in the non-Jews culture. And those are, I think Pinchas actually says, these are my two native languages, Ukrainian and Yiddish. Then, of course, you've got Polish, which is the language of the new masters. It's the language of the upper class of the village, the policemen, the authorities, the language of schooling, because this is the second Polish Republic after World War II. Then Russian replaces Yiddish for a while when the Soviets come back, when the Soviets arrive, I should say. And there's a very clear power structure between which languages are higher and lower prestige, what the function is. And this is very common, not just in Eastern Europe, but through other Jewish communities around the world prior to really the modern era and the emergence of modern nation states. And then he comes to Montreal, where this power structure is duplicated, right? Where you have French as the language of formerly the peasants, then the working class in Montreal, with whom the Jews are living and working side by side in the early generation of immigrants. Of course, Jews will largely switch to English as they becomes clear that English is the language of dominance, and because they're excluded from French Catholic schooling in Quebec. And they'll become effectively increasingly English speaking over time. So this fascinating power dynamic is replicated in many ways here in North America, at least for a time. And it's something worth reflecting upon throughout Jewish communities around the world, and what Jews feel is theirs and what is not theirs. Their sense of both closeness and distance from their Gentile neighbors. The sense of we're part of them, yet we're also distinct. And the sense of, well, particularly in the case of Ukrainians, both proximity and, as I think I said, a certain degree of nervousness, this fear of overstepping boundaries. Pinchas often says, Jews don't fight. It would be both disastrous if Jews fought back, and it's also not good manners. And this is a Jewish survival technique that Pinchas emphasizes at various times. Jews survive in this account by making strategic alliances with Ukrainians or with others. And yet, when you look at often at shtetl memoirs, we often find more physically assertive Jews. It's a different dynamic. So this is something also that I'm interested in here. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to add anything to the language question, but we can move on to what is our final question for the day. Finally, how do Holocaust survivor memoirs such as this one fit within the corpus of migrant and refugee writing in Canada? So let's start with Vardit.
So this question, I was very happy to get it because I work on the personal narratives of Jewish migrants, maybe you can call them refugees, some of them, who arrived to Canada before the Shoah. So some of them were not technical refugees, but they had survived World War I in a Ukrainian village or city or somewhere in Russia. And so looking at parallels between this Holocaust memoir, those texts, and also other texts and for example, contemporary refugee writing in Canada, which shockingly, at least to me, there isn't that much analysis of. It's very interesting to see how this fits in. What I found when comparing this to the writings that I've worked on for my dissertation, this text is much more about documenting and witnessing. So, and part of that, relating back to the language question, is that it's in English. So it's for people who aren't necessarily part of that community. It's displaying, it's talking about life in for Jews in Eastern Europe, life during the Holocaust and moving to Canada for Canadians, whether they're Jewish or not. As opposed to the material for my dissertation, where not only was that a again, there isn't the Holocaust element, but also they were writing in Yiddish. They were writing for mostly people like them, maybe their children. So they didn't have to, so there's certain expectations that are different. And for refugee writing in Canada, one of the expectations is, again, this witnessing and this talking about your experience as a refugee to make Canadians feel good about welcoming refugees and feel like, okay, we've helped these people who have been so much and through so much, and we know they've been through so much because we have that information now. They are kind of almost witnesses at a trial. So for example, I don't remember, I think this has been brought up by a couple of people actually, how Pinchas brings up names. So again, this is an earlier part of his description of the Shoah, but this is one of the earlier kind of just murders of Jews around the village. And he said, among the murdered was a family of 4. This is page 112. Was a family of 4 whom I still remember. The father's name was Binyamin, and one of the boys who'd had his bar mitzvah 2 or 3 years earlier was called Bentzi. These aren't people that he talks about earlier. It doesn't seem like they were his playmates, those figures that come into his life because they were a big part of his life. They only come into his life so that he can witness, he can document, he can say, this happened and I am proof to it. I am a refugee. I'm a witness to this genocide. And then at the end of his memoir, he talks about how good life is in Canada. He doesn't talk about facing, I don't think he talks about facing anti-Semitism at all, or if it comes up in a very minor way. And he talks about his success as his enjoyment of being in the theater, his success as a lawyer, his enjoyment of being part of a family, and saying to the Canadian readers, kind of, Canada, you did a good job. I'm proof that refugees will come and you can take them in and they will be happy here and they will be part of this Canadian country, this Canadian society. And that's what many other refugees to Canada, especially the recent ones in like the last 10, 15 years, where there's kind of an ongoing refugee crisis, and they're interviewed for newspapers and asked to share their stories to encourage people to support the Canadian government letting in more refugees. And there's this kind of pressure to talk about how good things are, to relive the past in the details as witnesses, but talk also about how good things are as refugees in Canada, so that Canada will let in more refugees. Proof of the travesty or the war or whatever's, however you want to describe, or whatever's happening in the country they're coming from, and proof that letting refugees into Canada supports the goals of Canadian society.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca is not with us, of course, because she's not feeling well, but Stephanie, would you like to read her response?
Yes, and it is a really good compliment to Vardit's comments, because Vardit compared set this memoir against earlier and contemporary writing, and Rebecca compares it with other survivor memoirs. Rebecca writes, A Promise of Sweet Tea offers an optimistic account of the migration process. While there were challenges, Pinchas documents his educational, professional, and family success in his adopted home. This is a feature we find in the memoirs of survivors who settled in Canada, a deep appreciation for their adopted country, despite its dark past of none is too many before, during, and after the Holocaust, when the country did not open its gate to Jews seeking an escape. But what of the unsuccessful migrants and refugees whose stories remain in the files of social workers, as documented by Paula Draper and Adara Goldberg? These stories rarely feature in memoirs. Blitz's book suggests the importance of community and creative outlets as ways of dealing with trauma. This is supported by a growing scholarship on the arts in the process of healing after trauma and genocide. His process of creating the memoir also suggests the significance of life writing as a healing process and the emotional work of unearthing memories from traumatic times.
Okay, thank you. This is not related to the question, but I was simply reminded in listening to this that one of the things that strikes you in reading this memoir is the tremendous poverty that is ever present in Pinchas's childhood, and how much it contrasts with the abundance or the superabundance that we see later in the Canadian part of his life. Okay, there's a lot one could say about that, but we have some time now.
May I add a comment about this one?
Oh yeah, sorry, David, I didn't see you on the list for this question. Please go
That's
ahead.
all right. No, I wasn't on it, but I did think about it because I thought it was a pretty interesting question. And I took actually a slightly different angle. So not comparing this one with other Holocaust memoirs, but thinking about refugee writing and migrant writing in Canada. It's not something that I know a tremendous about, but I think Vardit's point is really well taken about literature or narratives, written ones, or web projects or radio, kind of world of public Canadian public letters about migration and refugees in particular being techniques for liberal immigration and refugee policy, and also a little dose of Canadian self-congratulation, probably deserved, but nonetheless, like, this is what's happening sometimes when we put these stories into their circulation context in Canada now. But one thing that I think is just interesting and is a little bit puzzling, I have a couple of suggestions. The puzzling, interesting thing is that it seems to me that the Holocaust stories have kind of been ghettoized among the larger Canadian narratives and discussions about refugee stories. So a cursory scan of the field and of the scholarship and what's out there and what's being recommended and promoted by CBC and all this kind of stuff, you'll find many more stories, harrowing stories, difficult stories from Syria and Afghanistan and Sudan and Vietnam and Iraq and Iran and Pakistan, and very few Holocaust stories in this kind of category. Now, this is interesting and perhaps troubling. It might be an indication about sort of racialization question and some, Holocaust fatigue, and something about anti-Semitism, perhaps, about the exclusion of these kinds of narratives from the broader Canadian conversation. But it also might be, oddly, a product of the great successes of Holocaust commemoration efforts, with so many institutions and museums and programs that have done really a great job of making sure that these narratives are known and are parts of curricula at various levels of public institutions. And so I'm not quite sure, frankly, what to make of their kind of ghettoization from these other refugee stories. I just want to make one other point about the kind of the Canadian stuff. Is that it's really interesting to read this as I'm a historian of Canadian Jewish life and not a Holocaust historian, but the short part 3 of the book is really a veritable who's who of post-war Canadian Jewish life. So there's great Dora Wasserman and David Rome and Irving Layton, and it's like, I would love a part 2 of the memoir that just did a kind of whole Canadian life that certainly could be inflected by ways that the pre-war and war experiences shaped and impact all those relationships, because that's extremely important. But there's so much there, and this Canadian part, as with many survival testimony narratives, it just is part of the pattern that this part is pretty short, because it appears to the author that the really important part is a testimony. Yeah, so those are just some extra comments.
Yeah, it seems to me oh, sorry, go ahead, Vardit.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there because that's a really a few points very well taken, and it reminded me of something which I maybe should have incorporated in my own answer. But there's this idea of, or this topic with personal narratives, and I'm using personal narratives as a broad genre descriptor, by the way, which includes memoirs and autobiographies and and things that, and oral histories, like it's a broad term, but who has ownership over those stories? Once someone tells their story, okay, they have a right to tell their story, but then who has a right to then tell their story again, to repeat it, and what are their motives, who wants it to be used? There's actually a book by, I think, Amy Schumann called Other People's Stories, and how stories, and this applies to stories of genocide, but it also applies to, for example, stories of divorce, or stories of going to this great dentist and getting your teeth whitened. Who, once you tell your story and you write this, great review on Google, who can cut it out and take it and use that again? And I think with the Holocaust, it is this very tricky meeting point of racializing or ghettoizing in some way the Holocaust, but also, as you said, that there's a group that has claimed Holocaust stories. And so people, then other groups become very, very cautious about coming into that turf.
Interesting. David is very skilled at multitasking, something that I'm not. And I saw that he already responded to a question for him in the comments section. Where response to him, someone asked, could it be just that Holocaust memoirs deal with more distant memory, while, let's say, Syrian ones are much more about recent events? And David said, of course. That sounds right to me. And I would just sort of add to this, and I think it's been said, but I just want to say it again. I'm not an expert in Canadian Jewish history, but my knowledge of American Jewish history would suggest that there are certain similarities that, we think of Holocaust survivors and as people who settled here and who triumphed in the end. And what does it mean to be a refugee in the 1940s and 50s? How are they viewed versus how are they viewed now? And the tremendous antipathy to refugees in the 1940s and 50s really differs to the way we see refugees today. So it makes complete sense that these stories would have to be configured in different ways at different times, or different stories in different times, so to speak. Okay. David also wrote, I'll read his comment, I think there's also something at play here with respect to racialization and inclusion. The Whoopi Goldberg fiasco case in point. David, would you like to elaborate on that comment?
Yeah, I would, but I just want to actually follow up on something that you just said, Kalman, because I think it's worth highlighting that that refugee reception really matters in context. And we live in a moment now where, for the most part, in Canada, these are stories that we're eager for, we're thirsty for, we're proud of receiving, we're active about, and the deep long lag from the mid 40s through until at least the 80s, when these memoirs started appearing, and with some not we had an eager response and a thirst for these within the Jewish community. But I don't think I would have to do some more poking around to sort of get a deeper sense of how well, how much Canada wanted to think about the traumas of refugee experience. But I certainly do know that since the turn of the millennium, we have an appetite, a national appetite for these things. So Natalia makes the good point in the chat that these are current and they matter, and people are following stories as they unfold about difficult situations in the world. At the same time, we generally have an appetite for stories of trauma, and I don't think it's trauma porn. I think it's deep and sincere and really well-meaning. But we have stories about survival here in Canada, and about Canada's Canada's long racist history for Japanese people, for Indigenous people, for Black people, and people want to know and read about these survival stories of a different sort as well. And so Holocaust stories are part of a bigger landscape of these sorts of narratives. And I suppose, to get to the comment here, that I think at least some of the question of reception and of kind of uptake of whose stories get taken up and championed and read and taken seriously, and and focused on by whom, as Vardit rightly pointed out, I think has something to do with our landscape of racialization. And I just thought at the moment of this sort of Whoopi Goldberg fiasco, I'm sure everyone remembers of Whoopi Goldberg's comments, a long series of social media, faux pas and steps and confusions about the Holocaust just being kind of white on white violence that had nothing to do with race. And our context of North American understandings of race is so deeply color bound, and maybe a clearly like an overly crude sense of what victimhood looks like based on skin color. So I mean, this is maybe a pitch to say that there's all the more reason for more readers to engage with books like Pinchas Blitz's memoir, especially at a time like this.
It's actually quite remarkable now that you mentioned it, the degree to which, obviously the central event in this memoir is the Holocaust, and yet the degree to which racialization is not really expressed in its anti-Semitism of the Nazis or others is just a matter of fact. It doesn't need to be expressed, explained in any ways in this memoir. Yeah, Vardit, your hand is up.
Yeah, I decided that would be better than talking over you again. So yeah, I wanted to build on what you're both saying. And there's actually a really interesting article. It's about the memoirs of, I think, Syrian refugees by someone called Carrie Dawson from, it's called Treaty to Tell the Truth, the Anti-Confessional Impulse in Canadian Refugee Writing. And something that she brings up there is that there's all these elements of moving to Canada as a refugee that are uncomfortable and sometimes very negative. What she brings up, which is, one of the examples she raises, is the lack of choice refugees have, that they're kind of sent off to where either they have a sponsor or where there's space for them. A lot of people end up in more remote communities, and that's erased a little bit in stories. And I don't know enough about Pinchas's actual life to say what is erased there, but similar things happen. Again, there's very little time spent on the Canadian side of it, and that is part of the genre. It's part of defining this as a Holocaust memoir. Yeah, I think part two, Life in Canada, would be really interesting and give us so much to talk about and think about. But these ambivalences, also the ambivalence just of loss of connection that migrants experience, whether or not there's a war or a genocide, that he grew up somewhere and he's not there anymore. He grew up with certain things around him and certain habits. He had to learn a whole language. As a Holocaust survivor, with all that trauma that he was going through, he was also then put into a new language system, a new language school. That couldn't have been easy, but it's not there. All these difficulties, all these ambivalences that might come up are elided in the story. And one thing that you get a hint of it is very early on. He mentions that he's talking about how he never celebrated a birthday when he was growing up, that wasn't a thing. And he gives, again, this ethnographic guy, he gives an explanation as to why. But then in that same kind of, he sometimes moves thematically, not just chronologically. He talks about when his mother had to fill out forms for him for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And she chose a date, which he isn't sure it's his actual birthday. She chose July 19, 1932 to make him a year younger so that he could get an extra milk, in the as a refugee in the refugee camp. And again, that's one of those things that experience must have been extremely difficult, and that experience is part of moving to Canada as a refugee. So you get some hints, but he really doesn't go into all the ambivalences around being a refugee and moving to a new country and settling in.
Yeah, I don't, since I've never met the author, although I'd very much like to, I wonder whether he's recorded or written more that he could share with us because we're just beginning to unpack this, and there is so much to say about all aspects of this memoir. We have some time, so perhaps I will, if people in the audience would like to write questions, I'll be happy to read them. If the panelists would like to make any further comments, of course, they're welcome to. Um, so I'll give you a minute to, to write any questions if you have.
While we're waiting for people to come up with questions, I wanted to circle back to the question of language, which I thought the discussion around that was very interesting and gave a lot to think about in terms of people moving through and in between languages and the parallel of the multiple language situation in Ukraine and the multiple language situation in Canada. But something that I feel was a little bit, maybe people felt it was too obvious to say, is that in the end, this is a memoir written in English. And that language choice affects how it's written, and again affects also those questions of audience. Who's going to read it? How do we write for an English-speaking audience? Okay, if it's an English-speaking audience, Canadians are going to read it, and but also brings up the question of the translatable and the untranslatable. That there's terms, whether they're religious terms or terms for food or other words that he brings, and he mentions it in the introduction that sometimes he felt it couldn't be translated or he couldn't find the right word, it didn't quite fit, and that untranslatable, that inclusion of Yiddish words and Ukrainian words and Russian words creates on one hand a stronger tie to where he came from, to his childhood and the culture that he lived in, and also sometimes creates a distance with the reader, that there's a certain place the reader can't go. I don't speak Ukrainian. I couldn't follow him there. I wasn't even sure how to read the words. And so it creates an interesting linguistic dynamic with his audience.
Right. I touched upon it in my earlier remarks. Just the choice of the name you refer to this place as. The dominant academic trend nowadays is to refer to a place by what it's known in the language that's spoken, the official language of the country it's in now, right? Which of course is extremely misleading. Some people go counteract this by writing it in the language that's primarily used by the characters or the protagonists, so to speak, of what they're talking about. We write, Varsha instead of Warsaw if we want to emphasize the Yiddish Warsaw, something like this, Vilna instead of Vilno. And there is something really that is lost. And, I think about how Yiddish actually conveys some of the things you're saying. If you were reading a Yiddish memoir, what do? Well, of course, the tremendous amount of background knowledge is assumed. Occasionally, they'll explain something if they think it's obscure, but proverbs and practices are usually left to the reader to understand. What do they do with language in, Goyish language? Ukrainian is often called Goyish. It's the language, or Poyerish, right? The language of the peasant, right? In Yiddish. So they just leave it. They transliterate it into Hebrew characters because they expect the reader to know it. Because if the reader doesn't know Ukrainian, the reader probably knows some other Slavic language and can make sense of it. And we lose all of this once we bring it into English. We're forcing a certain understanding on it. So it is highly problematic, but it gives us a lot to think about also.
Just wanted to invite anyone who's with us, the 35, 31 other people, if you have a quick comment or a question, feel free to also use the hand function or join us in the conversation.
Yeah, I noticed Natalia commented on something that we've discussed amongst ourselves, the problem of Holocaust education, that the Holocaust is usually interpreted in North America as a case of religious intolerance rather than racial hatred, which, obviously I couldn't agree more, teaching Canadian and North American students more broadly. This is a real problem in how the Holocaust is taught in schools. Okay, I see Vivian's hand is up, so let's get to Vivian.
Okay, well, first of all, I wanted, excuse me, to thank all of you. I found all of you, and I know you all, David and Kalman and Vardit, all of your comments really, really interesting and very insightful. And this whole program is of great interest to me because I have been translating Holocaust memoirs for the Azrieli Foundation from Yiddish for, well, since 2012, so it's 20 years now. And they have reached their end. Nobody is finding new ones in their basement or attic or something like that. But I was involved in the Pinchas split book, and in particular for the language, deciding how much he felt it necessary to translate Yiddish words for the audience. And it was, he insisted that all his Yiddish expressions be in the book. So it was a challenge. But I guess my question is, and maybe it's to Stephanie too, that what happened with this book, because he was a child when he wrote it, it isn't the testimony of someone who lived through the Holocaust as an adult. The emphasis has been on his life in Canada in this discussion, which is important, and to compare it to other immigrants and so on. But I hope that we are not losing sight of the Holocaust itself and its uniqueness, and the unique treatment of Jewish refugees when they came after the war by Canada and other places. So that I guess that would be my question, and I would really specifically be interested in what Stephanie has to say, because I know that one of the requirements for publishing these memoirs is that there's a Canadian component. But there were people who wrote amazing memoirs in Yiddish, and they haven't been translated yet, for that very reason, that there isn't, I think, that there isn't an interesting Canadian component. Or sometimes because their experience in Canada was not happy and not a good one. And so that, I guess, I'm interested in that aspect. And I think it's wonderful that this came into a discussion about Canada and refugees in general and comparative and so on. But I hope that we're not losing sight of the Holocaust. And I have to say that there are some outstanding memoirs I translated that were not or have not been published yet, because the people are no longer here to go to the schools to talk about them. And that's an issue for the Azrieli Foundation. And many of them deal with the really outstanding ones about relations between Ukrainians and Jews and the Holocaust in the East that I think would be important to be published, since these are eyewitnesses. So that, I know this was a lot.
Yeah, as people have pointed out in the chat, the subject of Ukrainian-Jewish relations is extremely touchy. It's touchy, particularly in Canada, because both communities are well represented. It's come out, obviously, in the current war in Ukraine in various configurations. And this is an area that requires a lot of work, in which the memoirs really are a primary source to get at some of these topics. I don't know if you've read Shimon Redlich's memoir of his childhood, which deals with this Polish-Ukrainian-Jewish triangle, which is a very important book, I think. But it's only a beginning of this discussion. There's so much to be said about this topic. Stephanie, I'm sorry I spoke first. I should have given you the opportunity. Would you like to respond?
I'm just going to add one thing, that there is one in particular that talks about of a woman being hidden by Ukrainians, and Ukrainians who helped her, and also Ukrainians who betrayed her, and showing the whole spectrum of different Ukrainians. And I think that one in particular should be published soon. I hope it will be.
Hi, Vivian. It's really nice to see you and meet you. I hear your
Nice.
name all the time because you're so involved with the program, but I haven't got to meet you. It's a great question. So for this conference, the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, when I was thinking about how do we get more attention on this book, I thought, if we're going to do something here, we really need to bring that Canadian Jewish dimension forward. Not all of the books we publish need to include portions of the memoir about life in Canada. Two that come to mind are Ferenc Andai we published last year. His book ends in 1944. Anna Hegedus, her book ends in 1945. She doesn't talk about her life in Canada afterwards. So including that content in the memoir isn't a requirement for the program. The Canadian connection of the author is. So to be published in our series, you need to have immigrated to Canada at some point, whether or not you still live here afterwards. So when we were thinking about the questions, or when I was even thinking about who to ask to be on this panel, I was really thinking about both people with expertise in Holocaust studies, but also in Canadian Jewish studies, to really make sure that part of his story, that we could really dive deep into that and highlight some key elements. So that's why today's conversation was trying to focus also on that part of his life. I think I was sort of thinking about this when we're talking about audience, and I was thinking about what I've noticed the audience expects when we bring a survivor to speak to a public audience, a middle school audience, a university audience, whatever audience it is. I get this sense that people want to hear the success of the survivor, their life in Canada, that they were happy, that they had a family, that they survived. And I think that audience expectation shapes what the survivor says. They sometimes learn that that's the question they're going to get, so they include that when they're speaking, to try to show, yeah, despite everything, you can overcome. That kind of theme really comes out in audience expectations and questions, so it shapes what the survivors say. But not all of the accounts that we publish are of people who were I don't know how you want to define success in terms of education, professional life, family life. Not all of the books we publish are necessarily showing that. And I think it's really important that we have a collection that is diverse, and that even if it's what the audience wants, they want to hear someone was so happy afterwards that they had a good life after all they went through. That's not the case in all of the stories we publish. So we want to bring attention to the range of experiences that people had in Canada and up to the present.
Okay, I see we're only have a few more minutes, and I see that both Vardit's hand is up and Cassie, or Casey, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. So let's get to them. Vardit, you want to give your comment, and then we'll get to Cassie?
Yeah, and I'll just make it very brief. In terms of the Holocaust content in the story, it's worth reading. It really is. It's a very interesting and unexpected story of survival in the forest as a family unit, which really struck me. So Pinchas, from the beginning, it's him and his brother Weiser and his mom and dad, and they survive. They separate at certain points, but they survive together, and they make it to Canada together. And also how they, again, his documentary eye, what they did in the forest, how they survived. So it is definitely a big part of the memoir and worth reading.
Okay, thank you. Cassie? Cassie?
Okay, so I have a question for Vardit as well as Professor Koffman. Hi, Vardit. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Insightful as usual. My question relates to the transference of memory. As more survivors pass away over the years, the transference of memory is mainly passed through narrative. You commented on ownership of testimony. Can you speak well to that? And as well, did you want one person to answer first, and then I'll do the other question, or both?
I think we have time for this last question, so I think we should just pose that one
As
question.
well, Professor Koffman, I appreciated your comments on memory in relation to sensory and neurological processes. Okay.
Okay, so Vardit?
Hi, Cassie. Glad to see you in the audience. Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I can speak to that because the material I work on is written memoirs, most of which I found in archives. And so I do deal with the memories and the stories and the personal narratives of people who are no longer alive. And it's something, so I've had to address in my work. How do I do that while being respectful, being honest, and not, again, not claiming that story, not turning their story into my story. So there's a way to do it, and it requires knowledge. I think that when you want to retell someone's story, not in a casual way, but in a way of whether it's through film or through your own writings, you and to a wide audience. So it's not like I heard this and I'm telling it to my mom, but you're actually kind of presenting someone else's story to a greater audience. You have to give yourself the knowledge and background to understand their story, try to understand who that person is so that you don't put your own personality on it. And be as open and honest about also your relationship to this story. So for example, when I talk about the material I work on, I'm very honest with people that I'm a Canadian Jew. So I'm talking about this as someone who grew up in Canada and is Jewish, and that informs the way I represent these Canadian Jewish stories. Whether that's good or bad, I don't think it's either. It's just giving the person I'm talking to a context for understanding what I'm saying and how I'm representing these stories. I think it's complicated. I don't think it's impossible, and it just requires, again, that integrity and honesty with yourself and honesty with your audience about who owns the story and what's your relationship to it.
Okay. I see it's 10:31, and unfortunately we have to bring the session to an end so the next session can begin. So I apologize to everyone for that. I'd like to thank everybody for your participation today. It was a wonderful, wonderful panel, and I urge you all to read the memoir. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. It's a wonderful memoir. What am I going to say? It's everything has been said better already than by people other than by me. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.